Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us today for a very special webinar where we're going to discuss both DiGiCo and Klang, how they can work together as well as separate. This is going to be a fun event today, a couple of very fun things coming up we're going to talk about. But first, to remind you, this is a live webinar. We are here doing this live. So the whole point of that is for you to comment and for you to share, ask questions as we go through this process. We have a couple of great people in the background monitoring those questions. We're going to pop them up and be able to discuss those kind of at the end of each section or kind of at the end, depending upon how you guys ask them. So feel free to ask those questions, join in, be part of this discussion. And the thing that makes this incredibly special is that my co-host and I get to actually show you something brand new that is only going to be available on the live stream, and that is only going to be available at the end of this webinar. So stay tuned at the end. It'll be worth it, I promise you. Speaking of co-host, I would like to introduce Mollie Autherson. She is a technical sales specialist with DiGiCo. Mollie, are you there?
Hi, Ryan. Nice to be here. Quite excited for my first live webinar. So, yeah.
So where are you from? Where are you joining us from?
I'm from DiGiCo HQ, sat here in the office with my nice green screen behind and a full console setup to show you guys some integration and some Klang.
Fantastic. So that's actually what Mollie's going to be doing a lot of today, is actually showing us the Klang application in depth, showing us the integration, how the setup works and control works and all that. So Mollie, thank you for joining us today. I am Ryan Shelton. I am with Group One Limited, which is a distributor of DiGiCos over in the U.S., and I'm just outside of Nashville, Tennessee. And as mentioned, we're all live here doing this from our home, so if things all go wrong, we'll come back as soon as we can. All right, so what is this webinar about? This webinar is about what is Klang. We're going to talk you through some of the basic and the fundamentals of binaural processing for those of you who are not up to speed yet on that. We're going to talk about the hardware. We're going to talk about what are the benefits of using Klang, why you should do that, and how you can use it. So practical system diagrams. We're going to talk you through how things are connected, how they work in various setups and configurations. So the first thing when discussing what is Klang, it can actually be two different things. Same hardware, but we can implement them in two very different ways. First off, and most importantly, it is an immersive audio engine. Mollie's going to go into more in depth on what binaural processing is and what immersive actually means, but just kind of the 10,000-foot overview, immersive is the ability to put a musician, so the person playing an instrument or singing, if you're at a church leading in worship, it's to put them in the center and be able to position instruments, sound sources, audience mics, anything around that person and envelop them in this space. You've probably seen a lot of this done with loudspeakers. More recently, we've had a couple of our close partners on the speaker side of things with like L Acoustics with their LaISA platform, D&B with Soundscape. They immerse the room with speakers, and they have special algorithms and convolution algorithms that allow us to paint the space and to create just a sense of being immersed in this space. Klang is doing that for in-ears. It's not using any special in-ears or transmitters. It uses your existing infrastructure. You just need to add the processor to that. So we're going to talk about what that is, how it works. The other thing is, it is a personal monitor mixing system. This is actually one of the primary uses of Klang, at least here in the US. I know it's different throughout the world, but there are a lot of churches, there are a lot of performing arts centers, there's a lot of venues that use Klang as a personal monitor mixing system. It is incredibly intuitive, is incredibly easy to use, and Mollie's going to go through some of the benefits of, once again, why the binaural processing makes it an ideal choice for a personal monitor mixing system. So without further ado, I'm actually going to turn this over to Mollie, and she's going to take us through why we're going to use Klang and what are the benefits, how it works, things like that. Mollie, take it away.
Great, thanks, Ryan. So first up, why Klang? So firstly, it sounds natural and transparent. So I've got some good slides coming up to show you what we mean by transparent, but a little overview first. So we hear in 3D in our day-to-day lives. We've got sounds coming from all around our head, not just a stereo mix. So stereo's always been a compromise, even from when it first came about from mono. It's because it's not natural. We don't hear in stereo in natural life. So by using Klang, it's more like being in the room with these instruments as opposed to having a stereo feed fed straight into your ears. So as I said, we'll come back with some extra slides about the transparency in a bit. But next, we've got lower listening levels. So there's so much more space in the mix of a Klang mix, which means that typically drummers mixes, I'm sure you've had a few drummers where you're mixing for them and the click track is ridiculously loud just to be able to be heard over the top of everything else. With Klang, there's so much more space that the click doesn't have to be as loud. So if you can reduce the click track, and this goes for all of the other tracks as well, you're reducing the overall level of the mix. And the amount it is reduced by varies depending on how you're using it, but typically we found 3 decibels, even up to 6. But again, it depends on how you're using it. But even 3 dB over the space of a sound check plus the gig can dramatically reduce the risk of hearing damage for your musicians. So next up, we have got more stable mixes. So throughout a gig with various different songs, your musicians are likely to have to rely on other musicians in order to keep it musical. So for example, one song you might have to rely more on the bass player, next song maybe more on the drummer. And this could even change within a song. So for stereo, the way we'd work around this as engineers is to use snapshots and control changes via snapshots. However, with Klang, as we'll see when we get to the sciencey bit, your brain can focus in on different instruments. And when it focuses in on these different instruments, your perceived level is louder. So that means that you don't have to go and make a change on the console to make it louder. Next up, we have reduced listening fatigue. So listening fatigue happens after a long time of being exposed to sounds, where essentially your brain and ears get tired of decoding what's going on around us. So when we hear in 3D, as we do in natural life, this is more of a passive process because we're doing it all the day. However, with stereo, because it's not natural, our brain has to put that little extra bit of effort in decoding what we're actually hearing. And this is tiring. So an example of this is, I'm sure monitor engineers out there, you've been doing sound check, your musicians are happy with their mixes, and then an hour or two in, one of them turns around and says, "Have you changed something?" when you haven't changed anything. The reason for this is listening fatigue, because your musician's ears and brain have just gotten tired and given up a little bit on decoding what's going on around their head. So with Klang, we'll have a reduced effect of this. Next up, more space in the mix. So with a traditional stereo mix, you've got one line from hard left pan to hard right pan, where you've got to space every single instrument. And this can create a lot of masking between the instruments, especially if you've got things like heavily distorted guitars, which have a very broad frequency range. It'll mask other instruments. With Klang, you can place instruments anywhere around your head, both around the edges and up and down. So this means there'll be less masking between the instruments, which is particularly useful, as I said, with distorted guitars or any mix where you've got instruments with large frequency ranges. Next up, we have works with any pair of IEM or headphone. So as Ryan said, you won't have to go out and buy anything special. It will work with whatever in-ears you're using. Although we recommend that you use in-ears as opposed to over-ears. It will still work with over-ears. However, when we get to the sciencey bit, we'll see why it won't work quite as well as with in-ears. So back to transparency. So let's have a snare drum. And you can see from this red line, that's the general sort of shape that the waveform is taking. Now, when we're playing a gig, chances are you've probably got more than one microphone set up on the stage, and this will result in spill. So as we can see here, we've got spill of this snare drum on all the other microphones. And the yellow line here, that shows that what our brain is hearing in stereo. So in stereo, our brain can't really work out that all of these extra snare drums are in fact spill. Our brain can't work that out as well. So what we hear is more like this yellow line, so more muddy and muffled. However, if we look back to the initial line, the red line, that is what the snare is actually doing. Now, with Klang, let's have a look at what happens. So with Klang, where it's all the instruments are around your head, our brain is able to distinguish that these are in fact spill. So what we hear is more true to the original snare drum and therefore more transparent. Okay, so moving on. How does it work? The exciting sciencey bit. So firstly, our brain has 3 different methods we use in order to locate sound. Firstly, level differences between the ears. If I've got a sound source coming from the side of my head, so from the left side of my head, it will be louder in my left ear than in my right ear. Next up, we have frequency-dependent delays. So again, a sound coming from the left side of my head will arrive at my left ear before it arrives at my right ear. So there'll be a delay. And the reason why this is frequency dependent is the lower frequencies, they'll arrive at my left ear and then travel more around my head before they get to my right ear. So the delay there will be dependent on the speed of sound through air. Whereas with the higher frequencies, they'll reach my left ear and then travel through my head before they get to my right ear. So that delay will be dependent on the speed of sound through brain and skull and anything else you've got going on in there. Next up, coloration or frequency signature. So if I've got a sound source coming into my ear, it's going to bounce around my pinna, which is the flappy bit of your ear. It's going to bounce around that before it reaches your ear canal. And with all the different folds in your ear, it will bounce around in different ways. And before it reaches the ear canal, there'll be some coloration. So some peaks and some dips throughout the frequency spectrum. Now, this coloration will be different for every angle that the sound reaches our ear. Now, this point is very important when it comes to sounds coming from the same plane. So if we take this middle plane down my head, every sound along there, there'll be the same level difference and the same delays between the ears because every point, it's got the same distance between my ears. So I've got a small prop down here. This is called the cone of confusion. So my very own cone of confusion here. So any point on this cone, the level difference and the frequency dependent delay will be the same between my ears at any point on this cone. So how do we work out where on this cone sounds are coming from? And that is coloration and frequency signature. Next up, we have the cocktail party effect. So if we think back to the distant times when we were allowed to have cocktail parties, hopefully that will be very soon again. But you're in a room talking to someone and you can hear them perfectly well, despite the fact that there's lots of background noise going on with other people talking and maybe even a DJ system. Now we can still hear the person we're talking to, despite the fact that the background noise may even be at the same level as the person we're talking to. The reason we can hear them is because our brain is focused on them, so our perceived level of them is greater. Now, if you were to get a bit bored of talking to this person and your brain wanders a little bit, if you were to focus on someone else's conversation, your perceived level of their voice would be greater. So how does this work with Klang? This means that if we've got, say, a drummer and they've got a click track, but it's not overwhelming the mix, drumming along and then falling a little bit behind. If they then focus on the click track, their perceived level of the click track will be greater. So that means they can get back in time and then focus on any other instruments they may need. And finally, on this slide, we've got priority via position. So our brains, since the day we were born, have been trained that sounds coming from in front and slightly above us are important sounds. Now, this is partly from our parents talking to us from there. Our brain sees that as an important sound. And also from if you're out for a walk and then suddenly a bear jumps out, it will be there. And arguably, a bear jumping out at you is quite an important sound to pay attention to. Whereas sounds that are behind and below us are less important, because it might just be a mouse, which is arguably less important than a bear. So how do we use this for Klang? That means that we can put our important channels in front and above. Now, this can differ between musicians. So, for example, a bassist, they might want themselves and some of the drums to be the focus of their mix, so they can put them in front and slightly above. Whereas maybe the guitars or synths, they might not need to rely on them as much, so you can put them behind and down so that they're out of the way, but still audible if they need them. So now we've got some very good diagrams to show how the level difference and time difference works. So as you can see here, we've got a head facing up, and we've got blue for the left ear, brown for the right ear, and a sound source coming from in front and to the right. Now let's have a look at the diagrams. So the graph to the left, that shows level over the frequency. So as you can see, up to about 2 kilohertz, the level's near enough the same. However, above 2 kilohertz, the level in the right ear is greater than in the left ear. Now, let's have a look at the next graph. Oh, back, sorry. Thanks, Kyle. So the brown one, we can see that arrives just before the blue one. So there is our delay. Now, that draws a close to our sciencey section. If you have enjoyed this section and you'd like to learn more about it, then Phil from Klang has done a very good webinar on it called Binaural Basics, which is available on the Klang Facebook page. So check that out if you would like to learn more about the science. So now over to Ryan.
Thanks, Molly. I appreciate that. So as Molly said, absolutely, Phil Camp has done some incredible webinars where he goes deep into the science of this, as well as practical of just how to establish a mix and some best practices. I believe he has another one coming up in the next day or two with a monitor engineer to dive more into this as well. So definitely worth checking out. Just go to the Facebook page for Klang, and you'll see all that info in those videos there. So the next thing I want to take you through is the hardware. So some would say this is the boring bit. I'll try to keep it as exciting as I can, but actually to talk about the hardware you're going to need to be able to get an immersive mix to your artist. So the first thing out of the gate is our flagship product. This is the Klang Fabrique. It is an immersive audio engine, and you're going to see that on several of these pieces. What that means is that this device is capable of creating an immersive mix for the musician. So there are a couple of products we make that don't do that, that are just headphone amplifiers. We'll talk about that as well. But this one, the Klang Fabrique, is an immersive audio engine. So it supports digital audio protocols like Dante, AS67, MADI, ADAT, etc. It'll provide up to 16 mixes to musicians. Now, a mix for Klang World is mono, stereo, or immersive. It actually doesn't matter for those. So that's up to 16 mixes, and you can have up to 56 inputs. Now, the interesting thing about Fabrique is that you either have 16 mixes or you have 56 inputs. So as you turn up the number of inputs, you turn down the number of mixes, and vice versa. You turn up the number of inputs, and they just works as kind of a balance and a scale there. So something to keep in mind. You can definitely check this out using the software. There's a couple of things on the Klang blog that'll go into more detail, or you can reach out to us at either DiGiCo support or Klang support. You can find our info from the websites there, and we'll be happy to answer these questions for you on if it's going to specifically work for your application. Now, one of the big features that the Klang Fabrique has is something called root intensity EQs. So these are essentially manipulatable presets for EQs. So if I wanted to have a snare drum come to me, and maybe I had just a front of house console in my venue, and instead of having a dedicated monitor console, I wanted to use this Klang Fabrique for that, I'd be able to apply EQs to the inputs that are coming into this Klang Fabrique. So let's take a snare drum. I might want to put in something like a high pass filter, put in a little presence boost around 2K, maybe take out some tubbiness or muddiness around that 300 to 400 range. We have several different presets for snare drums that are built in, and then you can manipulate them, meaning you can adjust the parameters. They make it very easy for musicians to do as well. So it's a really, really powerful feature. Also, this box can be controlled from various devices via OSC. So later, Mollie is going to take us through integration with DiGiCo, and then we're also going to take you through the application, which will run on a Mac or a PC, Android, iPhone, iPad, any of those types of devices, and that is using the OSC protocol to be able to control these. You can also, if you're a bit nerdy, which if you're watching this webinar, chances are you are, then we have the opportunity to probably develop your own custom OSC scripts to be able to control certain parameters within this device. All right, as far as the hardware and the I/O side of things with the Klang Fabrique, it features 16 balanced analog line level outputs, and then it has an optional MADI expansion on this, and it's 64 by 64 channels. That would be at 48K, and the second MADI port is switchable to be another input. Mollie will show you that in the software in a minute also, but just know that both of those can be inputs, which is really helpful at 96K. In addition to that, you have a 64 by 64 channel Dante interface and 32 by 32 channel ADAT interface. There's word clock in and out. It's got redundant power supplies, latency of less than 3 milliseconds, and it will operate at 96K, 88.2, 48K, and 44.1. The next device up is a Klang Veer. Think about this as a smaller and fixed form of the Klang Fabrique. So it is an immersive audio engine. It has Dante AES67 and ADAT. It'll provide 5 mixes. Remember, those are mono, stereo, or immersive. 24 inputs go to all 5 mixes. So there's not any of that balancing or flexibility there. And the digital outputs of all 5 mixes, in addition to the built-in analog outputs. It features root intensity EQs. You can also control this one via OSC. As far as the I/O for the Klang Veer, you have 4 individual stereo headphone outputs on the front. You also have 4 stereo balanced line level outputs via D-sub connector on the back. It has Dante interface, 24 channels of ADAT in, and then of course less than 3 milliseconds of latency, ultra low output impedance, which is perfect for multi-ear in-ear drivers and multi-driver in-ears, and as well as large over-the-ear headphones. It has adjustable gain ranges, so you can kind of optimize. If I'm using some large cans, I might need to switch that up to give myself a bit more gain and to give my volume control just kind of a good starting point or a comfortable starting point to control that. This one only works at 48K or 44.1, so something to take into account. But most Dante setups that we've seen are running at 40K anyway, so this were probably a good fit for those. Both the Fabrique and the Veer can be cascaded, which means you can tie multiples of these units together. There are several installations that we know about where they put 2 or 3 Veers together because they are looking for around 24 inputs, but then they need 10 or 15 mixes to be able to provide those. And several installations that we know of where they have 2 or 3 Fabriques, so they need more inputs, more mixes across just for their whole entire stage or for their group that is performing. All right, the next device to talk about is the newest. This is called the Klang DMI, or the DMI Klang. It is an immersive audio engine that is in a card format. DMI stands for DiGiCo Multi-Channel Interface. These you'll see on things like the Quantum 7, Quantum 5, and Quantum 338. You'll see them on the SD12, the S series, and also in something called the Orange Box. And the Orange Box is a protocol converter to take you from one format to another, and you can put the DMI Klang card in there. And what this does is it provides 16 mixes. So remember, mono, stereo, or immersive, and it will provide 64 inputs to all 16 mixes. So this is actually a massive step up in processing power. It'll do this at 48K or 96K, and because we moved to an FPGA-based platform and algorithms, it is down to a 1/4 millisecond of latency. So that is 0.25 milliseconds. And the ports you're seeing on the back are not actually anything like Dante or any proprietary protocol. Those are actually just switched Ethernet ports. There's a dedicated one for connecting to a console. We're going to take you through those diagrams in a minute. And then there is a control A and a B port for going off to like a Wi-Fi router or an access point, and also going off to like a hardwire connection for a laptop or something you may be running by front of house or by a monitor console. The next product to talk about is a Klang. First thing you'll notice is this is not an immersive audio engine, so it does not provide 3D processing for the inputs coming into it. It is merely a Dante, or a very high quality Dante headphone amplifier. So you're going to have 4 individual stereo headphone outputs. It features high-end converters that go anywhere from 44.1 to 192K. It'll do all that at 24 bits. It has a Dante input, super low latency, so it can run to 125 microseconds. Ultra low output impedance, so once again, perfect for those multi-driver in-ears as well as for large headphones. It can be powered via an external power supply or via PoE, so that's power over Ethernet. If you're looking for a clean way to distribute headphones on a stage, it doesn't get any better than this. We've used these a lot for string sections, for orchestras, where you need to be able to deploy things where people can hear a click or guide tracks, and it's just a simple Cat5 that you run out to power this unit and provide audio to it, and everybody has individual level control. And then when you fire up something like Dante Controller, you're going to see each of these that are individually assignable. So if they all need to be fed off the same aux or off of different auxes or sends from your system, you can do that. It is compact, so it's a third of a rack space. So you'll be able to put about 3 of those in one single rack space if you needed a lot of density for a headphone amplifier. And then it features those same adjustable gain range switches to go from negative 12 dB, 0 dB to plus 12 dB as well. The next thing is we took that same Klang and we put it in a 19-inch rack mount chassis. So it's going to feature everything we just talked about. The biggest change here is that it adds additional balanced line level analog outputs on the back. We've seen a lot of people use this, especially for like when you might be in a studio application, or you might have a drummer where they want something like a butt kicker and they want to be able to have their in-ears, but they also want to have a send going to a butt kicker or a drum sub of something like that. So everything else here you're pretty much going to see is exactly the same, except the power supply is now internal. All right, so all that as far as hardware goes. Don't forget to stay tuned till the end of this live stream because we're going to get to show you something new and exciting. Now let's jump into some diagrams real quick. So how do you use Klang? How is it practically implemented? First up, we're actually going to take a look at how we do it as a standalone personal monitor mixing system. So let's put up a console and let's put up something like a Klang Fabrique. So here we have a DiGiCo SD5 and a Klang Fabrique M. That means it has the MADI option on this. And let's just show you how we connect this with MADI. So here you're going to see we're going out from the console to the MADI in on the Klang Fabrique, and then we're taking the MADI out of the Klang Fabrique back to the MADI in on the console. It's as simple as that. There's no software to run. There's no real routing to do other than what you're doing on the console. There'll be some routing in a minute that Mollie will show you in the software side of things, but this is it as far as connectivity goes. If we were running this as a standalone personal monitor mixing system, all we would really need to do to complete this would be to connect a wireless access point to this device so our users could grab their phones or their tablets and to be able to control their own mixes from here. Now let's get a little bit more complicated and let's look at 2 units. So let's say we need more mixes. So 2 Klang Fabriques. It's actually very easy. We just cascade this on. So you're going to see MADI comes out of the console into the first Klang Fabrique. Then we go cascade onto the second one, and then we return that second one back to the first. Now the reason for returning this audio can be used for a couple of different things. First and foremost, there's a feature Mollie's going to take you through called Engineer Q. That actually allows you, the engineer, to be able to listen to any of the mixes across not just 1 or 2, but basically however many devices you have cascaded together. So you can just have one channel that you solo. Maybe you've routed that back out to a secondary or spare IEM pack that somebody can listen to and just queue up any of those mixes that they need to hear. And we're going to use that return audio path for it. The other thing that we can do is we can actually return all of these mixes. Instead of using analog outputs on the back of the device, we can return all of these mixes back to the console and distribute them through our existing infrastructure. So maybe that is IEMs being fed off of something like an SD rack if you're in a DiGiCo ecosystem. Or if you have a full Dante infrastructure already, you could distribute those back through DMI through Dante through the rest of the setup. All right, so let's get a little more complicated. Let's actually switch to Dante this time. So we have a Quantum 338 console. That console has a DMI Dante card, and we're simply just going to connect everything together. So the Dante is built into the Klang Fabrique, and we're just going to go from the console to the first one. And really here, your topology and how you wire this doesn't matter. This is going to follow whether we're using a switch or whether we just directly connect units together. The only thing to keep in mind is you will need a laptop initially or a computer to run Dante controller so we can actually configure the patching and the routing, sample rates, and how these Dante modules are configured. Once we're done, you don't need that laptop anymore, and it's going to remember those settings. All right, so here's a full-blown system. We're actually going to build this based off of Dante, and we're going to take you through this. So we have a console, we have a Klang Fabrique, and this time we have a switch. And so initially we're going to tie the Dante ports on the Klang Fabrique and the console to this switch. Then we are going to add a couple of wireless IEMs that are going to connect right to the analog outputs on the Klang Fabrique. After that, we're going to add a wireless access point for control. So this way we can connect to things like iPads, iPhones, tablets, Android devices, Amazon Fire tablets. Basically anything that a consumer is going to have will connect to this and be able to run the app. After that, we are going to take a control application. So this is actually Klang Fabrique on a laptop, a Mac, or a PC. And we're going to be able to run this ourselves. There's different user modes. Mollie's going to take you through that. This would be, I'm set up in an admin mode, so I want to see all the mixes. I want to be able to select any of them, dive into any of the mixes, be able to use that feature like the engineer queue to be able to monitor those. So we need an app to be able to control this. This could be wired to wireless, but it was easier to draw a orange line here when we were building the PowerPoint. All right, the next thing, we're going to add our Dante PoE headphone amps. These are the Klang Quellas. So this is a way we could put additional mixes out on the stage. Maybe a couple of these musicians, instead of using wireless, would like to be hardwired, or maybe there's something like a drummer or a keyboard player where you have the band tied together, and it makes sense to distribute a couple of these Dante PoE headphone amps. This could also be used for something else, like maybe we have an orchestra or a string section or an ensemble on stage, and we want to be able to provide them with click and guide as well as a basic aux mix, which could be fed from either the Klang or from the DiGiCo. Now, another setup you might see is actually using the Klang DMI card. So here we're going to put the Klang DMI card inside of the Quantum 3 console that we have, still using Dante to move audio in and out, but we're also going to put in an SD rack. We're adding the control cable there. We're going to add an SD rack that is feeding the IEMs, and then we are going to have Opticore connecting that SD rack and feeding back to the console. So we have an SD rack connected via Opticore, we have a Klang DMI, and we're connecting all the control ports here so those musicians on stage can use their apps on their devices to be able to control it. All right. On to the next one. Mollie is actually going to take us through the software and show us just how intuitive this app is. Mollie?
Great. Thanks for that, Ryan. So first up, Klang app. It's available on all major platforms, so Mac, PC, Windows, all sorts, iOS, Android, and it's free to download. Now, the next slide here, I've got a QR code, so as long as you're not watching on your phones, get your phones out, scan it, and download the app. It's free to download, and it's got a demo multi-track in it. So that means that you can download the app and listen to Klang and have a play around with moving the instruments around your head and see what you think. So now let's have a look at the app. So I've got my Klang app set up here. Hopefully you can see my mouse there. So first up, we're on the faders view. So as you can see, this looks like a general faders sort of view. So we've got big faders, which you can click and move, change the level of each instrument. And we've also got small symbols, color coding, and our names here. Now, all these three things are custom. So if you're using it without the DiGiCo, then you could have different names for each musician if they like a different naming scheme. And then even with the DiGiCo integration, you can have a different color scheme for each musician, different symbols, and whatever they want, what they're happiest with. So as you can see, we've got solos and mutes on each channel, which are just standard, as you'd expect, a mute for this channel and a solo. Now this is a solo in place solo for this mix. Now along the top you can see we've got our different mixes, which all have their own symbols as well. Now the reason why I can see all of the mixes is because I am in the admin user mode. So for your musicians, you could limit their access by putting them in a lower down user mode, so they won't be able to mess with anyone else's mixes. So you can also see we've got plus and minus, so if they want to make slight adjustments or don't want to use the faders. Now, as you can see on this faders tab, we've got two small circles. Now that shows that this tab has two views for it. So if I click it again, we've got our groups view. Now these groups are custom, so you can add whatever channels you want to each one. And today I've got 8 groups. So those of you who are used to using the Klang app, or at least the old version, you're probably used to having 6 groups. However, in the latest software update, which came out a couple of months ago, you can now have up to 16. But we'll go through some of the other updates later on. Now in the group view, we've got solo, so you can solo a group or mute a group. But the really cool thing, or at least my favorite thing about the app, is what we like to refer to as intelligent mixing. So one typical scenario for personal monitoring is if you've got a band where they maybe haven't used personal monitoring before and maybe haven't even done any mixing before, so don't really know what they're doing or how to get a good mix. And I'm sure monitor engineers, you've seen it before, where musicians have tried to make their own mix, thought, right, I need more drums, turn the drums up. Now I need more bass, turn the bass up. And before you know it, all of the instruments are just ridiculously loud and the mix doesn't sound good. The way Klang helps with that, with our intelligent mixing, is if you watch as I turn the drums up, if you watch the other groups, their dB readouts, as I turn up the drums, you can see it's turning down all of the other instruments. And then as I turn it down, it turns up all of the other instruments. So it's like a relative mixing. Instead of turning just one thing up, it also brings everything else down. So that also is a way to protect our musicians' hearing. Now that is the end of our faders view. Let's have a look at the stage view. So if you've used Klang before, you probably recognize this view very well. So we've got our head here and a purple ring around it. Now on the purple ring, we've got all of our instruments and we can drag them around our head. So things have to sit on the purple ring, or they can sit on this line through the middle of the head. Now this line represents traditional stereo or mono if you put it in the center. So I can click and drag that onto the line in the middle. Anywhere else, it will just jump to whatever is closest. Down the side here, we've got our groups that I laid out beforehand. Clicking on one of these groups, it just focuses in onto those instruments. So this is especially useful for if you've got large sessions, maybe you've got a whole orchestra as well. This view can get quite crowded when you want to try and move things around. So this groups section really helps with that. Down the bottom here, we've got these 4 buttons: mono, stereo, 3D and i3D. Now using Klang, you don't have to use it as an immersive mix engine. You could, if you like the personal monitoring side of it, just use it in stereo. The way to do that is click stereo and you'll see we've now just got all the instruments spread across the head, and also mono as well. Or you can use this just to compare. So flip between the two, see what your musicians think. Now i3D, without fail, every single demo I do of Klang, I get asked, what is i3D? So we've got 2 rings here in i3D. Now this is a bit of software preparation that was added in a while ago, so that if you've got the app on your phone, you'll notice going into i3D, the outer ring moves as you move. So with i3D, anything on the outer ring will turn around your head as you move with a motion tracker. So you will require your a phone or a tablet with a motion tracker. So I'm using a laptop today which doesn't have a motion tracker, so won't move. Anything on the inner ring will stay fixed to where it is in relation to your head. Now, if you've not got the motion tracker, then there is absolutely no difference between the inner ring and the outer ring. So let's move back to 3D. So as we saw before with the faders view, there are two views of the stage view. So if I click this again, we've now got a different view. So this shows elevation as well. As we saw, as I mentioned earlier, you can place instruments above or even below your head. So the very center of this is in front of you with no elevation. We've then got the left ear here, the right ear, and then curving back to the back of your head, so a bit like a world map. And then we've got moving up to the top of your head and then down to underneath your head. And also, again, the group's view works here as well. Next up, we have the meters view. So this is just meters showing you if you're troubleshooting when setting up, if you've actually got audio. So we've got the audio coming in, which is via MADI today, and then our mixes going out. This view will not be visible if you're in a couple of the lower down user modes. Now the config button. As you can see here, we've got three little indicators. Now these are our system indicators to show you if everything's working. The first one, N, refers to the network connection between the app and the processing unit, which today is a Klang Fabrique. So if it's green, everything's good. If it's red, the connection has dropped out or someone's pulled the plug or something. And then orange and yellow show that the connection's a bit slow. The next one, C, refers to the clocking. So I'll show you in a minute how we can set the clock. And then D, because I'm running DiGiCo integration at the moment, refers to the connection to the console. So that's all working fine. This may be a K if you've got the Klang set as the master. And if you've not got the integration on, then you won't see this. Now the user modes. So clicking and holding on config, we've got 4 different user modes that we can run in. So musician mode, you would put your musicians' iPads or tablets in this mode, so they'll only have control over the level and positional data of their own mix. Personal, they've got the same access, but they can also control the namings and the groups of their mix. Show, you can control everyone's mix, and then admin, you've got everyone's mix, but you've also got access to all of the setup details as well. So I'll leave it in admin so I can show you everything and turn our integration on. Now running through the config menu briefly. Connect is where we connect to our device, and we can set our remote auxes for the DiGiCo integration. In channels, this is where we set our color coding, names, and as Ryan mentioned earlier with the root intensity EQs, we can turn them on here. Next up, presets. This is like sessions or snapshots menu. So you can save your own sessions in Klang, and it has its own snapshots menu. So if you're using it as a standalone, you can still have snapshots. System and routing, these 2 pages are not visible for the DMI because it's all done automatically. However, if you're using a Fabrique or a VR, then you will be able to access these. So first up, clock speed, whether you want 48 or 96. And now we've got the number of mixes. So as Ryan mentioned with the Fabrique, the more mixes you want, the less inputs you'll have available. So this is where you set that. And you've also got control over what the second MADI port does, whether it's an output or another input. Now to routing. So this is an easy point-to-point router where you can route your inputs to your outputs. And this is also handy with the VR and the Fabrique. You can use your device as a format converter. So if you need a last-minute broadcast split, so MADI to Dante or Dante to MADI, you can do that with the Fabrique or even the VR, although the VR you've got less options because you've got less outputs and inputs on the back. We've also got clocking your clock source down the bottom. Next up, info. This is just information about the box, what's going on, firmware, your power supply. You can see I've not plugged in the first power supply, so you've got some information there. You can also copy logs if you need, and some other settings, so things like the IP address. Finally, we've got the external control panel. So this is all to do with connecting other devices, so your DiGiCo console, or if you're using other OSC devices or MIDI devices. Now, let's move on to the cue functions that Ryan mentioned. So we've got two cue functions, the musician cue and the engineer cue. And they are these two buttons in the top right corner. So the first one, which looks a bit like an iPad, that is our musician cue. So say your musicians are personal mixing, one of them has more experience, used to doing it all the time, very quick at getting mixes they want. And maybe you've got another musician who it's their first time, they don't really know what they're doing, so might need some help. What your more experienced musician can do is select the musician cue and then select their friend's mix. Their friend's mix will then be sent to their headphones and they will be able to see and adjust their friend's mix, so to help them out. And finally, we have the engineer cue. So the engineer cue outputs are separate on the routing page, so you can route that to wherever you want, be it down to output or even back into the console into a separate bus that you want to send to your in-ears as an engineer. So when this button is pressed, whichever mix you're looking at is sent to the engineer's cue bus. So if I'm looking at the percussion mix, we're hearing the percussion mix, or the bassist's mix, we can hear that. So that is the cue function. Now I'll just take you through the new functions in the latest software. So first up, we've got DMI compatibility. So you can now use the Klang app with the DMI Klang. And with this, now you can have up to 16 mixes. The top would look a little crowded. So the top section where we've got all of our mixes is now scrollable if you've got 16 mixes, so that you can access them more easily. Second, as I mentioned earlier, we've got more groups. So if I go into the channels menu and scroll down, you'll notice that our last group has got a small plus and minus button on it. So this is where you can add more groups or take groups away. So now up to 16 of these. Next, there's automatic renaming. So I'll stay in this view. If you are using DiGiCo integration with the last software version, you'd select all your remote channels and then have to pull the settings in order to make these names change. Now this is all done automatically. The second you pick a remote channel, the name jumps across. And that's the same with our mixes across the top as well. And finally, the second function. So in the stage view, let's have a look at this. The second function down here, if I press that in the stage view, you'll notice along the purple line, we've now got some references. So I'll just toggle that so you can see, if you watch the purple line. Now these are just some references so you know where to place things if you need it. This is also the case for the other stage view. So now we've got these purple dots. So you've got some sort of reference, maybe if you wanted to get things symmetrical. Now, if we go to the faders view, you'll notice, as I mentioned earlier, we've got the solo and mute. However, if I turn on the second function, these become position and edit. Now, if I click the position for a certain instrument, let's pick the hi-hat, we jump to the stage view with just this instrument isolated. Now it will jump to whichever of these two views that you were last on. So if you're normally using the head view, it will jump to that one. The edit button, if I have a channel and press the edit button, we'll then get the menu where we can select the name, the symbol, and the color, as well as the group. So that's a quick way just to jump and edit some of your channels. So that brings us to the end of our whistle-stop tour of the Klang app. We'll see a little more of that when we go into the console integration. But anything to add, Ryan?
Actually, we had a lot of good questions that have come through so far. Most have been answered by Phil Camp and Dan and Matt, who I see moderating that. So thank you, guys. There is one, though, Mike Lightcap. He was asking if we can actually turn off the intelligent mixing. Several people have said, that's great, that's awesome. Can we turn it off? And no is the short answer to that one. It is on for default, and there's no way to turn that off for the time being, though I know that feature request has been made before. So stay tuned for a future software update, and we'll see if that one makes it out there. But Mike, thanks for your question. The rest of you, thanks for your questions too. I see some great ones coming through. Now, Mollie, also thank you for the detailed tour of taking us through there.
All right.
If you need more info, or if there's something specific you're looking for, you didn't quite get the answers you needed, klang.com/blog, or just go to the Klang website and click on blog. It is an amazing repository of information, so you can just type into the search bar and just put Klang app. You could put musician Q, you could put any of these things that you're looking for, and that search engine is going to bring you to an article that is going to take you through detailed steps of how to set things up, how to implement them, as well as just general user guides and quick starts. So it's a great resource as you're setting up, especially if you're new to the Klang environment, or maybe you've been to it for a while and just getting to a new feature you haven't used yet. So a great thing to do. Now, before we jump onto the integration side, I wanted to show you how we connect things physically. So system diagrams when we're integrating with DiGiCo. This is one of the big things. Up until now, you saw Mollie's tour. You can see how intuitive the app is. If we want to hand that to a musician, allow them to use it. Well, there's a case to be made for a monitor engineer who wants to be able to use this powerful immersive audio engine. And maybe you don't necessarily want your musician to have control, or maybe it's an environment where they don't need, so whether it's sightlines on stage, whether it's a very active band, where they're just running around, it just doesn't make sense for them to be mixing themselves. So what do we do for monitor engineers? So this has been worked on for a number of years. It was rolled out rather recently. I think it was about a year ago at NAMM that they showed off the integration with DiGiCo, and it's evolved very fast since then, with more features, more speed increases as we're going to take you through these things. So let's talk about hardware and how we connect first. So as before, let's take a console, let's take a Klang Fabrique. We're going to obviously throw a switch in here, and we're going to have a laptop. Once again, it doesn't matter, Mac or PC in here. But the first thing we need to do, since we're controlling all this, is we need to connect the control ports on all of these devices. So this is not audio, this is just control. We're going to take the Klang Fabrique, run it to the switch. The console, run it from its network port to the switch, and the laptop, and run it to the network switch. So this is very important. The console does not interpret from the Klang Fabrique or the DMI card or the Klang Veer directly. It needs the Klang app running on a Mac or a PC to do this interpretation between the device and the console. So you have to have that device running there, so Mac or PC. So we have them all connected up via a network port now, but now we need to connect the audio. So you're going to see the red and the blue lines that were drawn in there, and that's MADI out of the console, in this case an SD12, running to the Klang Fabrique MADI in, out of the Klang Fabrique, and back to the SD12. Now, this return path is even more important because we're actually not going to be using things like the Engineer Q mode in this setup. We are going to be returning each and every one of those mixes back via MADI back to the console. And we're going to go through that workflow in a second. All right, let's look through another one real quick. This is using the DMI card. So here we have an SD12. Instead of using Klang Fabrique, we've put the DMI card inside of it. We are using that dedicated console control port on the back of the DMI card, connecting that to the console's control port. We are taking one of the other control ports, in this case Control A, and we are connecting that to the laptop. So there's no switch needed in this setup, but remember, even if we're using the Klang DMI, we need that Klang application running on a Mac or a PC. So this is a rather simple setup, but gives you an idea of how it works. Now, what if your console doesn't have a DMI port, or you don't have a Klang. You can use the orange box. So the orange box is going to need to be set up in the same way. We're going to take the control port from that DMI card, connect it to the console. We're going to take the control A port, connect it off to a laptop running the Klang app, and then we need audio in and out. So we're going to take the MADI out of the console, run it into the DMI card, and vice versa, return this back. Now, as mentioned before, an orange box merely changes one format into another. So here it's just doing one-to-one routing of whatever we put into the MADI port on the orange box. It is going to push it over to the Klang. The Klang is going to process it and return those mixes back out of that MADI port. So it's an incredibly simple setup. Just so you know that we also have packages not just with MADI, but also with Dante. So if you're not living in a MADI ecosystem or you would like to be in a Dante ecosystem, this is an incredibly powerful package, just 2 RU, and we can do 16 mixes, immersive mixes for you musicians here using this Klang DMI card. All right, so let's actually talk about how audio moves around and how we're going to set this up on the console. Here I have a screenshot from a DiGiCo, and here this is actually running the SD software. And you're going to see on the left we have a selected input channel. We've labeled this one lead. So this would be like our lead vocal channel. And on the right-hand side you have a stereo aux master. So this is our master output. In this case it's the bass player's mix, which is arguably the most important of the mixes. So in this case, normally we would take and we would just turn up the lead vocal to the bass player's aux node, and you would see that signal, and we get a dotted line that runs us across, and it feeds into the top of that aux master, and then we apply whatever processing we need to on that aux master before it's routed out to the bass player's ears or whatever they're doing. Now, when we do Klang, we're going to actually change that workflow. So here's a Klang Fabrique. We're actually going to use the direct out of the channel and probably many other channels and run these to a Klang Fabrique, which is going to run into the bass player's mix. So we're actually going to set up a mix for the bass player on the Klang, and we are going to have that mix come out into the input of the stereo aux master. Now, how do we get it in there? You could take just a channel, an input channel, and just route this in, but there's actually a built-in feature in the DiGiCo SD software called merge input. So if you select the top of the stereo aux in, you're going to see this highlighted box here called the merge. It's got a level control. Everything is matched unity levels across these devices, so just running it at unity would be ideal. And that'll let you select your input, route it from whatever source, whether it's MADI or Dante, or however you're connected to the console. Now, what's very important is that the software not allow you to simultaneously send from the aux node feeding directly to the aux versus sending through that direct out. And that is something the integration handles automatically for you. Mollie's going to show you that in a minute. Now, as far as inserting and using a Klang DMI, nothing changes. We're actually going to use the same workflow, the same signal flow to get our audio in and out for processing. The only difference here is instead of routing outside the console to something like a Klang Fabrique, we'd be routing to one of the internal DMI slots or to something like an orange box for processing. Still need to return it and merge it into this aux input. So a couple of things. Monitor engineers, you need to set up a stereo aux mix for every person that's going to have a Klang mix. So on your console, you're going to set up all of your stereo aux mixes, and you're going to merge the returns of all those mixes that you set up in Klang into the console. All right, so with that, I'm going to actually hand it back to Mollie, who's going to take you through the software side of things, both on the Klang app as well as the console, on how you operate this and also how you navigate around and actually select something and pan something. Mollie, back to you.
Great, thanks for that, Ryan. So my setup today, I've got my SD10, which is running version 1143. Now, in order to do the integration, you'll need at least version 1090 or greater. So I've also got a Klang Fabrique here and a laptop running the Klang app. So first, let's take a look at the console. So as you can see here, we've got our the aux section of our input channels. Now, we've got these little Klang Gs here, and that represents that this aux node has been clanged, turned into a Klang node. So when it's turned into a Klang node, that means that the audio is no longer being sent from this point to the aux bus. It's now using this as an OSC controller for the Klang app. So you've got your audio coming out of the direct output, which is then being merged into our aux channels. So as you can see at the top, I've got our merge input here coming from the MADI which is our fabrique. And don't forget to turn it on, because no matter how many times I do it, I always forget to turn the merge inputs on. So that's a handy tip for if you're not getting any audio through your auxes. Now back to these channels. So these are now Klang nodes, but how do we change them? So if we click on there, we've got our aux sends panel that comes up, and you'll notice that we've got a Klang button here. When this Klang button is off, clicking on these brings up our menu, our Klang menu for each mix. When this button is selected, clicking on an aux will either turn it into a Klang node or turn it back to a regular one. So if I click aux 6, you'll notice we've got the Klang G appear. Click it again, it's disappeared. Now I'll turn that off, and clicking it, nothing happens. So let's have a look at the drummer's mix. So now we've got this panel down the bottom, and clicking on the head, we get a larger view. So now we can change the positional data of where it sits around the head. Now let me switch to another camera view. You can see that this can be done either on the touch screen or with the encoders underneath. So it just depends on how you prefer to work. If I switch to our Klang software, as I turn this on the console, you can see it moving around the head. Now back to the console, we've got this bar down the side. Now this represents elevation, so I can click on that, or use the touch screen, or use the encoder underneath. Now in the Klang app, if I navigate to the second stage view, you can see that Tom 1 moving up and down. So back to the console, we've also got mono, stereo, 3D and i3D. Now these buttons just control whether this channel is on the 3D ring, on the stereo in the middle, or mono. Next up, we've got solo. So this is the same solo that we saw in Klang. So if I toggle that, and then we have a look in the Klang app. So as I toggle it on the console, you can see that changing in the app. Now back to the console, the next button along is on. So this is the equivalent of the mute button in Klang app. So if I toggle this, we will see that channel is getting muted and unmuted in the application. Finally, we've got level here. Now this is our aux send level. So if you're using aux sends on faders, which is a very handy DiGiCo function, if I move the fader of that channel, we can see that level is changing here. And then if I jump to the Klang app, by moving the fader on the console, we are seeing that fader in Klang move as well. Now, another quick way of opening this view. So instead of having to select, what you can do is on the master screen, use your aux nodes or aux sends panel. So this is found in layout under aux nodes. Now this method is especially useful if you've got multi-screen consoles. So you've got a dedicated master screen and then your channel screen. So something like an SD7 is brilliant for that. So this is our last selected channel. So we last selected Tom 1. So we've got no views open on here. And then from here, I just select, let's go for the guitars. And now we've got the guitarist's mix has popped up here. And you can have this enlarged or smaller depending on what you prefer. So next up, let's have a look at soloing. So another great feature of the integration is if I solo a different channel on the console or a different mix, it will bring up a different mix in Klang. So as you can see, we will always be looking at what we're listening to. So next up, let us take a look at another feature of the integration, which is the labeling. So you'll notice that the labels on the channels in Klang, so we've got kick, snare top, snare bottom, they are the same as on the console. Kick, snare top, snare bottom. If I change one of these, so let's change that to kick. So the second I press enter, you'll notice that that changed on the Klang app. So all of this is live updating and also works for the mix names as well. So one thing it's worth mentioning is snapshots. So the DiGiCo snapshot system also stores your Klang data, so your positional and level data, which is very handy, so you can move things around during snapshots if you want to. And you can also save things to the session. Although we recommend you save both a console session and a Klang session, so that keeps all of your setup data the same as well. Now let's have a look at the external control panel. So this is normally where you'd connect your iPad running the DiGiCo iPad app or another OSC controller. You can now connect your Klang here. And you'll notice that we've got a few options across here to do with Klang. So Klang bypassed, what you can do is, if the connection to your Klang processor unit is compromised, maybe someone decides to pull out the power or someone drives over the network connection with a forklift, right? Who knows what can happen when things are live, but you need to get rid of the Klang because it's not working. Bypassing the Klang means that the audio will now get sent to the aux from the aux position that we're traditionally used to. Now I've added this function onto a macro, so anyone using Klang, I highly recommend that you make these macros. So they're the same thing, but just the opposite. So one turning on, one turning off. So for the bypass, I'm turning on bypass and turning off the merge input. So this is a very important step, to turn off the merge input for your Klang mixes. And then our other macro is turning off the bypass and then turning back on the merge input. So if we navigate to the channel view, if I turn on my macro here, you'll notice that the Klang Gs have gone grey, and also the levels have jumped. Now this is because, due to another button in external control, which is link aux to Klang levels. Because this is off, we can have two separate values that exist separately. So our aux send and then our Klang send. So I'd recommend you have this option off if you're building a session that already has aux mixes, stereo aux mixes, and you want to add Klang over the top. So that means that should you need to bypass the Klang, it will revert back to the original stereo mixes that your musicians are used to. If you're building a session completely from scratch and you want to jump straight to Klang, I'd recommend you have this button on. So that means that should you need to bypass the Klang, your levels for your original aux sends won't all be off. So that means your musicians will still get something. So this is all just backup in case things go wrong. But again, highly recommend that you make these two macros. And what you can do, if any of you have seen Tom's macro video for the SD consoles, is the on and off actions here. So this means that I've got one button which will turn them off and on. So check out that video if you haven't already. So that is the end of our console integration demo. If you would like a step-by-step process of how to set it up, then you can either watch Phil's webinar all about console integration, where he takes you through from scratch how to set up the integration, or if you visit the Klang blog or the Klang website, then you can find a step-by-step. Or if you go to klang.com/DiGiCo, that will take you directly to a step-by-step guide of how to set your DiGiCo integration up. Now, integration works for any SD or quantum console. So the DMI Klang will work in the S series, but that is audio only. You will not get the integration. So any SD or quantum console.
Awesome. Hey, Mollie, we've actually had some good questions come in, so I'm just going to ask you them, and we'll go through that. The first one that we're going to address is Sam Rogerson. He asked, do you have to set up your Klang file first on the macro PC and then enable the DiGiCo integration, or will channels appear in the Klang app as Klang is turned on each aux node on the DiGiCo?
So you can do this two ways. So if I pop to the Klang app, we can have a look there. So on the config page, we've got these buttons here, which is on and off. So you can either turn these on in the Klang app, or the equivalent of that on the console. If I pop to the console view, you'll see I'm going to turn it on and off in Klang still. You'll notice here, it's turning that into a Klang node and off again. So you can either do this from the app side, or you can do it from the console side. It all depends on which method you prefer.
Awesome. So basically, to summarize there, what the integration has done is we've tried to mirror a console and a Klang processor together. So they essentially work as one. And the process that Mollie was taking you through, that is, it really can just be done with a blank Klang session. After you've configured the handshake and the communication between the two, you can just go on and begin setting up your console and enabling things as needed. All right, we have another one from Jamie Hickey. He is asking, how does Waves feel about sharing the console's network control port through a switch? Is it best to use a DMI card to enable the use of Waves and Klang on SD7 Quantum? Mollie, I don't know if you have any experience with this. I've done a couple of installs so far where we have things on the same network. It can work. And it does work most of the time. What I would highly suggest is that you not put a wider area network, your LAN for the building or other gear, on that control port also. Best practice is always to keep them separate if at all possible. You're a monitor engineer, so you probably shouldn't be using Waves anyway, but we'll talk about that at another time. But let's see, if you are using both of those together, maybe you're a console that is doing the integration, you're doing front of house, you're doing Waves, you're doing everything on one console, and you need those tied together. It is possible to put them together on the same network, but I would limit that network to only being DiGiCo and Waves and Klang, and I would not have it going to a wider network, maybe as part of your building or infrastructure. I do understand that can be a limit with some IT guys not wanting you to have your own access points and things like that, but it's definitely worth having the conversation with them about that. Now, we actually got a number of questions on if DiGiCo is going, or rather if Klang is going to integrate with anybody other than DiGiCo. Alan Heath was brought up, and I know just from the people that we've talked to, a number of Yamaha users actually use Klang as well in their installations and their applications. As you saw Mollie taking you through here, this is not just as simple as tying together something like turning up a level and having it follow it. It is a deep integrated workflow that's designed to speed up your mixing, so allow you to have these additional tools for immersive mixing as a monitor engineer, but also to keep you fast fast while you're doing this. Anything from the channel naming to being able to select and control things from either location, that takes a lot of work for these two systems to be tied together. You'll even see that within our own line. Mollie mentioned that the integration works with SD and Quantum. It does not work with S-Series. I did see somebody here asking earlier about that. I was trying to remember their name. I think it was Jeremy. Was asking that as well, as if we could see that on S-Series. Something I would love to see also. As you see, it's a lot of work to integrate these two. I'm not going to rule it out for the future, but I don't yet have a timeline on if that's going to happen or even when it will. Let's see here. Last couple of questions.
Just another point going back to that question
Sure.
about integration is Ryan mentioned earlier about OSC. So we have had some users where they've used other consoles with like soft channel type things to use that to control elements of Klang. So there's still an element of integration, but nothing like the DiGiCo integration. So if you're unfortunate to not have a DiGiCo for one day, then you won't have the full integration.
Yeah, I also saw, I believe it was Phil that was jumping in, helping somebody who was asking specifically for Allen and Heath. And it's very possible to tie something like a MIDI or MCU protocols to be able to fire snapshots back and forth between and have a Klang follow something like your Allen and Heath console. So nothing that is, in my understanding at all, in the plans for the future for integrations. As you can see, that's pretty deep. Now, I am going to get this name wrong, and my apologies, but it's, I'm guessing, Duismo, something. So how much of a level difference is experienced between the Klang level and the normal aux level if you bypass the Klang? Mollie, you want to take that one?
Well, as we saw in the integration demo, you can have a different level for the Klang level and the bypass level. So it all depends on whether you've got this link function on or not. So
let's say you have the link function on.
So if you've got the link function on, then they should be roughly the same level, although the overall mix, it may sound louder because, as we saw in the science section about the sounds being around your head and perceived level and so on. So it will be a different feel. So the perceived level could be different.
Yeah. So psychoacoustics actually plays a big part of this. If we were to actually measure things, if you had your merge input at Unity, you had your master for the mix on Klang all the way at Unity, then yes, these would all be exactly the same level when they're in bypass. But as Mollie mentioned, there's a lot more going on here other than just taking a level between one or the other. We're actually changing how you're experiencing that signal, whatever it is. All right, I think that's good to move on.
I think that's everything, unless there have been any more questions that have popped up.
I don't think so, actually. I think everybody looks like they're quite excited about the singing advice. Brad says, my older orchestra peeps will love this. Agreed. Agreed. Yeah, there's a lot to being a musician. There's a lot of demands on a musician in general. It doesn't matter if they're an orchestra or if they're in a band. And then to throw something like learning a new tablet on top of that, so a new app on a smartphone, you tend to run into all the frustrations. They're not on the right Wi-Fi network. It wasn't charged beforehand. Just in general, learning something with a touchscreen, absolutely, Brad. That is a valid point, and I love the fact that we're going to be able to offer them a tactile controller that they can just plug some headphones into, turn up an encoder. It's going to have a dynamic channel label on there so they can actually see what the name of the channel is that they're turning up. So very excited about that as well. All right, now before we leave you, there's a couple more events coming up this week for DiGiCo. So there is an Ask Us Anything this Friday. This is a special theater-focused one. So we're going to have Nevin Steinberg, who's sound designer for Hamilton, Jason Crystal, who's a sound supervisor for Hamilton, Julie M. Sloan, who is sound mixer for Tina, the Tina Turner musical. That'll be Friday, June 19th at 7 p.m. British Summer Time, as well as 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time here in the U.S. And then we also have Locked Up with DiGiCo. That'll be the following Saturday, June 20th at 6 p.m. British Summer Time, as well as 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. That'll be with Josh Lloyd, who's Technical Project Manager for Britannia Row Productions, and he's going to be talking about how to build a session for an awards show. So don't miss those. Make sure to jump on to the DiGiCo's Facebook page and get your reminders to find those streams. Mollie, thank you so much for taking your time out, for helping put all this together, for taking us through the apps, for setting all the gear up in the offices over there. I really appreciate it. It's been great to go through this with you.
It's been likewise. Hopefully you've all enjoyed and learnt something, and enjoyed the sneak preview for those of you who were watching live.
Well, once again, thank you so much, everybody, for taking your time out to share that with us. If you have questions, keep them coming in the comments. Reach out to us via our support, which is available on the DiGiCo website or the Klang website. Ask us your questions. Let us know what we can answer for you. I saw a couple people that we'll definitely be commenting back to in the comments below as well. So once again, for Ryan Shelton, Group 1 over here in the U.S., thank you so much for joining us. Mollie over there in the U.K., and Dan, who you never got to see, who's hiding in the background. Thanks for everything as well. We'll see you guys later. Have a great week.
Bye, guys.